Hello and welcome to Take Me Home, the podcast offering a social democratic alternative for the politically homeless. My name is Sebastian Moore.
And I'm Hilary Salt.
And today we are joined by Jacob Reynolds, Head of Policy at MCC Brussels and an Associate Fellow at the Academy of Ideas. Welcome, Jacob.
Thanks so much for having me on. It's a real pleasure.
Now, you're not in Brussels right now, are you?
Not this second, no, but I do spend the majority of my time in Brussels.
And just tell us a bit about that. What do you do there, and what's that like living in Brussels post Brexit?
Yeah, well, my friends never tire of reminding me the irony of someone who was kind of very outspoken in favour of Brexit, then pretty soon after taking a job in the belly of the beast in Brussels and being subject to the very kind of visa restrictions and travel headaches that I was told were the most important reason to never vote for Brexit. So I'm always aware of the irony there. But we set up MCC Brussels under the executive director Frank Frady, who some of you might know or some of your listeners might know. And we are depending on who you speak to, either the kind of bad boys of Brussels or the kind of persona non grata people of Brussels, insofar as we try and provide a little bit of an alternative to the otherwise quite staid political and intellectual environment of Brussels. We publish lots of reports. We have loads of events. We've been cohering something of a different narrative around the Brussels technocratic anti-sovereignty approach to national and international affairs. And so that's what we do at MCC Brussels.
You must be incredibly popular in Brussels.
Yeah, but very much not. But that's part of that was almost part of the job description. So the people who we hire have to be comfortable with suddenly it all going quiet if you tell someone at dinner what it is you do.
Yes, I do listen to your podcast, Jacob, and I find it really helpful because I've definitely taken my eye off the ball of EU news since we've been outside of the EU. So it's good to keep at least a bit of a weather eye on what's happening there, particularly given what's happening in the UK. So you probably know about our kind of great reset where the Labour government is effectively taking us back into the EU by stealth. Things like dynamic realignment and stuff like that. It's just really... It's important, I think, that we don't lose track of what's happening in the EU.
Yeah, well, it is, and thank you for the kind words about our podcast, which your viewers can go and find with the MCC Brussels podcast on YouTube. But one of the things that's always struck me is that, I mean, there are ways intellectually and politically that the UK seems ahead of or on an accelerated timeline compared to European countries. But equally, there's lots of ways in which European countries are ahead of the UK in many ways. And so it's been quite eye-opening spending time in the European political context where you see some of the trends, I mean, like what some people in British politics refer to in a slightly kind of Daily Mail fashion as the Islamo-left alliance. You see that in a slightly more accelerated form on the continent, and you wonder how it's going to come to the UK. The kind of politics in Europe of the cordon sanitaire, the desperate attempt to keep right-wing populist parties out by any means necessary, and the stacking of the institutions against them, that kind of stuff is what we're going to see a lot more of in the UK, I think. So it is a useful place to understand what's coming next.
Right.
So 2026 has got off to a wild start. We often joke on the podcast that we've got to get these episodes out quickly because if we don't, everything will have changed and Trump will have invaded another country by then. We had the Venezuela stuff, we had Greenland, we had Iran. We referenced this last week, but the Battle of Ideas panel on sovereignty, Battle of Ideas North, which took place I think 2 weeks ago, it kept changing name because every time there was a new geopolitical development, we had to add in a new country. I wondered, because you spoke about the vibe shift at a talk I attended last year. I wondered if we, because that's a term, that was very much a 2025 term with Trump coming back in January 2025. I just wondered, what is the vibe shift for anybody that doesn't know, or we might be talking about different things.
Yeah, well, as you say, this was a lot of comment around the second Trump presidential win. And I mean, I was quite critical of the term in many respects because I think it basically tried to say that the reason there was suddenly a turn towards right-wing politics in America and maybe beyond that it was suddenly acceptable, for example, to be critical of immigration, more hostile towards transgender ideology in schools, whatever it was. And people essentially tried to say that that was because something had changed, not in politics specifically, but in the culture. So something had changed culturally, and the phrase people love of kind of politics being downstream of culture, i.e., that you change the culture first, and then people's political views just kind of change without anybody really thinking about it. So the vibe had shifted. It wasn't as if people attributed Trump's victory not to political arguments being won, but to a kind of cultural sense shifting that made it suddenly possible to be and acceptable to vote for Trump. And there was obviously some of that, like you saw, I mean, especially among some subsections of young people, the MAGA hat became a symbol of kind of like rebelliousness or even cool on some university campuses. So there was a cultural element to Trump's victory, but the broader thing I think was more fundamental and less ephemeral and more important, that something had shifted politically, intellectually. And that is, I think, in some ways what people were actually trying to get at when they were saying the vibe has shifted. They were like tectonic intellectual historical plates had moved in a period of time, and then that was reflected in the Trump victory. And I was kind of more interested in, and am more interested in understanding what those big political and intellectual changes are than paying attention to kind of niche podcasts or whatever elements of culture or the existence of a right-wing art gallery, however interesting those things might be, as the kind of really fundamental things that underlied the shift in Trump's direction.
And do you think, so one of the things, I was at a meeting last night actually with Blue Labour, and one of the things we were talking about there was the fact that it's really hard for political parties to have any political legitimacy these days. And that to me is a kind of reflection of the fact that there's not really any democratic debate. And it feels there's two things, you know, that seem to be two ways countries are going. There's a kind of the populist right, you know, strong leader way, or there's the technocratic EU, if you like, way. And both of those seem to signify an unwillingness of people to talk to the populace and to have any kind of, and to forge that democratic legitimacy. So is the vibe shift part of the fact that it's a recognition of the fact that there needs to be more listening to people?
I think part of what the big political changes are would be reflected of that, but it strikes me that lots of people who use the term vibe shift or trying to over attribute too much importance to culture are kind of making the same mistake that you identify, because they base, and you see a lot of this on some of the kind of media, social media, somewhat intellectual personalities that are the outriders of the MAGA movement. You get this sense that we're in charge now. We're going to do whatever we like. You guys have had your chance. We're not going to explain ourselves. We're not going to justify ourselves. It's just our chance to be in charge. And it was almost as if there's like the pendulum theory of politics, where it like just swings backwards and forwards, and the people who are now in charge don't feel they have any need to justify what they're doing, continue winning the argument. They're in power, everyone else can shut up, and is like now our chance. And I think lots of people who use the term vibe shift generally, even if they might be critical of Trump, they generally think of politics in that way, that it's just like almost like an accident every 4 years who gets in, but when you are in, that's your chance to kind of go after the opposition, and you no longer need to justify yourself more broadly. And arguably some of the difficulties that the Trump administration has got itself into, and I think especially of the what is to me very odd but is nonetheless real polarization over the deportation agenda, where you have these what seem to me to be on the verge of slightly insane people trying to physically block ICE agents blowing horns in their ears and all the rest of it. But there's clearly this like enormous polarization in American society. And on the one hand, you feel sympathetic with a leader who's got a democratic mandate, go out and execute your mandate. But at the same time, given the existence of such polarization, you think you also need to be constantly explaining yourself and justifying yourself, because otherwise you might be in a position where you have lost the mandate that you originally kind of set out with.
I spoke on a panel in Manchester a couple of weeks ago with Tom Slater, the editor of Spiked Online, And he said something which got me thinking at the end, which was that we need to be polarized about the right things. So that polarization itself isn't an issue. It's just that we need to figure out what those things are that we become polarized about. Do you think that in regards to, ICE in America, do you think that's the sort of thing which is sort of healthy polarization? And do you think that the people on the let's say Trump's side would say that this is a battle we need to win, rather than that there's no concessions that can be made with the other side that are protesting? Do you have any sympathy with that?
Yeah, well, I think it's a good remark that because polarization is not the enemy. All politics is going to involve some kind of polarization, and the alternative to this is always this kind of hope not hate style of politics, where if only we could all just be nice to each other and shut everyone who disagrees with us, but we're the nice ones. The niceness kind of masks a censorious undertone to it. So I do think you need polarization in politics, and there are some political battles you simply need to win, especially where it's fundamental issues of state legitimacy are at question, and the fact that in these situations it seems that the kind of legitimacy of the American state is literally called into question because you have laws that can't be enforced, which is what it is. You have people who are in a country illegally breaking one of the most like fundamental kind of elements of sovereignty, political sovereignty, and the state can't enforce its laws because you have either police forces in local areas or governors or even just some very loud minority of the citizenry who won't allow the state to exercise its power. That's a fundamental question, and maybe you do need to win those kind of arguments. But I was alluding more, I think, when just the existence of such polarization needs to be taken into account. You might decide that you need to win it. You need to win the battles, but that still puts the onus on you to keep explaining yourself and not just assume that the mandate you receive. We know how quickly things change in politics, right? You can no longer assume that the mandate you got even 3 months ago is like still the democratic mandate you enjoy today. So I think that process needs to be ongoing. But I am sympathetic, as you say, to the idea that on some fundamental issues you do need to be able to kind of win. You need to succeed.
I think the thing that I keep worrying about is that we've talked about this, that there doesn't seem to be any forum for that political debate and narrative to be set out these days. So, you might have had, I suppose in America they used to have these kind of town hall meetings, didn't they? And in the UK you had structures like the trade union movement, like community groups where there was that debate taking place between the political class and ordinary people. And it feels to me that one of the reasons why there's just a lot of men shouting, is the way I kind of experience politics these days, is because there isn't that democratic debate happening anywhere. And it kind of feels like we almost need to reinvent ways that we can have that engagement.
The political, as you've said in the past, that Hilary said that it feels like we're living in a pre-political age once again, because the political, the arena in which we have these conversations and hash out our disagreements, it seems to have disintegrated.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, those what are kind of mediating institutions that the great political writers like de Tocqueville or make a lot of, or even Hegel. It's like the centerpiece of Hegel's political philosophy. But so I really agree with that, and that is as sociologists have noted for quite a long time, that's like a kind of structural feature of the present age that we have to take into account, and the kind of structural demobilization of society, the atomization of society is one that you have to take into account. And so every initiative that gestures in a different direction is a very important one. But I also think there are some non-structural, more transient factors that we could usefully address in this area. And I think of the way that lots of these mediating institutions, be it charity organizations, school boards, I think of the Scouts, things like that, have become taken over by a very small minority of the population with the support of well-funded NGOs and people effectively on the payroll of the state. And so if you were to just tackle that and take the control that these institutions exercise away, this kind of what I call the kind of NGO class, away from these institutions and reclaim them as they once were a little bit, we would still be faced with lots of structural demobilization and the consequences of modernity and blah, 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 and all of that stuff. But if you could just trust that when you, for example, send your kid to Scouts, they're not going to be forced to not just recite the Cub Scout law, but also recite the latest kind of diversity mantras, that'd be an enormous step forward. And so I think that there's a job to be done that's much more closer to home, where we can just, if people can begin to win the arguments and take back control of those mediating institutions away from this kind of parasitic ideological class that seem to inhabit them, that would be an enormous step forward too.
So you said it's you used the metaphor of a pendulum. I'm just wondering, is there something that is unique about this particular time? Because obviously we had that period of woke, progressive liberal ideology that seemed to invade every single space, and that seemed to be a character of the ideology, was that that's what it wanted to do, right? That's what people wanted. It's to have no space where which wasn't infiltrated by these ideas. And I mean, people would say that the working class never went for woke, right? And that it probably didn't affect working class areas as much as sort of middle class, the chattering class. But I think one element of the vibe shift, and I mean, it's easy for people to kind of attribute their own their own desires to the thing that's shifting, right? So I say, oh, it's shifting in my direction. But one thing I see is that all of these institutions, it feels like now they're no longer able to do those things, and the scrutiny will be higher. And I feel like just in groups of friends of mine, it feels like now people are able to contest things. Like if someone were to say, a man can become a woman, 5 years ago or even 2 years ago, I feel like it was the done thing. You could not push back on that. Whereas now it seems much more common. And I feel like there is a cultural element to the vibe shift. The fact that it does feel that period of progressive liberal ideology, which we were under for a long time, has fallen away. And it almost feels necessary. And we're in a weird era now, but it feels necessary for us to then move on to the next thing, because in order to move on to the next thing, we need to recreate that political where we were talking before, where you don't make everything a moral issue, right? Where it's you can have your morals, which can impact the political, but you put it in the middle so that you can attack each other's arguments rather than attacking the individual. Because I think during that woke era, it was very much, it's not that I disagree with you, it's that you're a bad person for thinking something contrary to me.
Yeah, no, that's very astute. And three quick points in reply. First, I always think that whilst you want to avoid hyperbole, the point you made about woke being like by design having to invade every area of our existence, that's structurally what you call totalitarian, right? The great writers who identified the essence of totalitarianism usually tended to figure it out in the fact that there was no longer any possibility of any distinctions. And so politics had invaded every single space, and there was no respite from it. And in that respect, that's true. Secondly, one of the things that interests me about this period, and why I do try and resist the sense that just something has shifted and now we can speak our minds, is because that gain we have now is the result of lots of people previously speaking their minds when it was very, very unpopular to do so. And so lots of people, where you think of gender critical feminists, or you think of people in schools, whatever it was, lots of people, well, at least some people, were having a really, really hard time for a period of time and still holding the line. And the period we enjoy now is the result of, in part, the result of that people put in a lot of political work to educating the public about these issues, winning the argument, convincing other people that this just wasn't like some university madness, but actually had real world applications. People highlighted the effects of, if you take kind of gender ideology, people highlighted the effects that this had in schools, in prisons, in sports, all the rest of it. And so the climate of freedom we enjoy now is in no small part thanks to the hard work that was done done there, and there is a kind of how that exactly shifts and at what moment is an interesting question for social psychologists or something. But there's obviously an emperor's new clothes type quality to these things, where eventually it does just take, even if it takes someone to just point out that the emperor's naked, and then people can suddenly say the same thing. And then thirdly, I mean, when I alluded earlier at the beginning of this discussion to big structural tectonic things that have shifted too, I think that does play a role in the downfall of woke. If we woke as a ideology kind of suited to the end of history, it's a ideology suited to the sense that there are no big military, strategic, ideological, political questions on the table. And when suddenly there are again, for some kind of accidental reasons, as it were, like a pandemic, some structural reasons, like a war breaking out on the European continent, and some political reasons, like the return of national sovereignty to the forefront of debate through movements like that took place in 2016 around Trump and Brexit, that these, even if they don't at the face of it seem that connected, they absolutely challenge the ascendancy of woke, because they put real political issues back on the table, number one, which displaces what seem like slightly phony concerns around identity. But number two, these things raise questions which the woke ideologies we just cannot answer, and call into these things into fundamental question. We think of the great kind of populist revolts of our time. They're ultimately a revolt around the sense that people have no control over their lives, which is kind of obviously clear in the Brexit slogan, but is clear elsewhere. And what they're ultimately saying is that people are saying is, I feel like everything was done to me. Nobody consulted me. Whether that's about the minutiae of EU regulation or more real issues to people about what their children are being taught in schools, it's the sense that nobody ever bothered to ask me what I think about these big things that are shifting, these big things that are changing in my life. And so the end of woke and the beginning of the populist revolt are ultimately, I think, quite fundamentally connected, as well as there being some fortuitous timing in the fact that we now have real political and geopolitical issues that require serious attention. And for example, it's becoming obvious even to European Union elites, becoming obvious that you can't have a serious discussion about national security if your army is preoccupied with implementing diversity policies, that you can't constantly trash your nation's history and then turn around and expect people to be prepared to go and fight a war. So we're kind of luckily, unluckily in that sense too. But the fundamental point is that the political things are a response to the excesses of woke as well, obviously.
I was just going to say, so it's self-defeating in a way, isn't it?
Yeah. I've always thought the one of the definitions I liked about populism was it's the fight back against the colonization of everyday life by the elite. So the sense that your everyday life is dictated to by people who you don't. And I like the word colonization, not just because we get to steal a word from the critical race theorists, but because it seems to share something in common with the way that in colonial societies, the native population were treated with this kind of contempt. They weren't allowed their own culture. They have to have it imported onto them by people who knew better. And that's how our elites think about us at the same time. They rule over us like they would a kind of colonial population.
I think Fight Back Against the Colonisation of Everyday Life might be the title of the episode.
Right, yeah.
I quite like that. So I think we've talked quite a lot there about the kind of democratic elements of sovereignty and the need to, have a connection with the people to decide what the democratic view is. How do we tie that back to sovereignty? So it seems to me you can look at this both ways, can't you? That it's hard to have a democracy without a sovereign nation, because it has to be bounded, and you have to have a people who can exert that democracy. Is it the other way around as well, that you can't have a sovereign state without that democratic input?
Yeah, I know. Actually, at the panel that I spoke on, somebody referred, I think, to external and internal sovereignty. And what I meant by that was not just like the sense. I mean, in one sense, that means externally you have a sovereign country which has borders, and internally the central government exercises control over the territory. Right. So that's true. I place myself in the philosophically democratic tradition, so I believe that almost inevitably, historically speaking, when you start talking about sovereignty, you're implying concepts that have to do with democracy. It's just like not inevitable, but a somewhat logical consequence of beginning those arguments about sovereignty, for the simple reason that you're talking about the state exercising effective power over a territory, and power always calls into question authority, and on whose authority do you exercise the power? And the historically successful answer to that question has been, I have my authority democratically, or at least I represent the people. And that's why the kind of sovereignty moment in European history, and you think of the great writers, even people who were hostile to democracy, like Hobbes, nevertheless had to immediately start making the claim that the sovereign was exercising power for the good of the subjects. And as soon as you accept that, then you're on a road which doesn't inevitably, but does logically kind of lead you in a direction of having to at least consider what their interests are. And as soon as you're considering what their interests are, well, at some point you have to ask them. So I think there is, and this is a contentious point of philosophical and political history, but I think there is a natural kind of consonance between sovereignty and democracy, and that's why it is quite important. And even if that wasn't the case, in the modern world and in the contemporary world, but certainly in the modern world, the kind of pre-contemporary period, the best way that the state could mobilize a society and exercise effective sovereignty over an area where you need an army that's willing to fight, a police force that's willing to police, schools that are willing to teach, all the rest, in order to control the territory, you need all these things. The great mobilizing potential of democracy was clear, of people having a stake in their society in a sense of being asked about which direction it goes in. So there is a mobilizing component to democratic sovereignty as well. And so all of these things that we see in the contemporary period, the inability of the state to mobilize people towards shared goals, the lack of authority that the police seem to enjoy in wider society, the fact that people won't fight for the army, or don't want to, or that the army kind of loses its privileged status. All of these indicate that we have a profound crisis of democratic sovereignty, that people don't feel they have a stake in their society, and as a result, those powers of the state become harder and harder to exercise. So this is where at some point the kind of technocratic approach to governance eventually runs out of road, because they literally can no longer deliver the goods. And in a previous era where society wasn't that democratic, but everyone's living standards are rising, the schools work, the hospitals are okay, whatever, maybe we can, and this has been, some countries have offered this bargain to their people, as it were, like, you stay out of government, but we'll deliver the goods. But at some point, if you can't call on people, if you can't mobilize people, then you can no longer even deliver the goods. The civil service doesn't work. The schools are like, the authority in schools is called into question. All those examples, police, etc., that I talked about earlier. So there's run out of road to continue the technocratic approach. It just no longer even delivers the goods. And so there's a kind of point at which, a decision point that has to be faced, where you either accept that nothing's ever going to work again, or you have to find out how to mobilize society democratically.
And if that technocratic approach has run out of road, and I liked what you were saying about there's a natural tendency towards democracy once you've baked in certain assumptions. And I almost think that in contrast to woke ideology being sort of self-defeating, the thing I love about democracy, and why I call myself like a democracy fundamentalist, is because it is self-correcting. Now, I guess the risk is that in retaliation to a more technocratic or authoritarian approach from government, the populist backlash, and we saw this with Trump, with Brexit, where the people felt like they weren't being listened to. There was that democratic deficit, and then they had a reason to get out and vote and have their voice heard. But then where does that go? Because I feel like we're almost in a period where the populist leaders are still looking backwards, and they're still like sort of playing on nostalgia. And it feels like everybody, the technocrats, the populists, feels like everybody is incapable of seeing what is to come and looking forward to the future. I mean, you look at Trump with the deportation stuff, for example. I think that when a threat to democracy is when you say this thing is more important than what the people think, what the people want to happen. So there's a risk to our security, right? You see this with like counterterrorism things being very damaging to freedom, right? And Trump, I think that's happening with the deportation stuff. It's being seen as a battle to be won. And I think that due process is being overlooked in certain places. I think with Iran, it's similar, where the arguments that there was a big sort of non-interventionist support for Trump. He was seen as the non-interventionist candidate in that the Republican primary of 2016, and if you think of the establishment as being the interventionists, George Bush, it seems like the democratic will was pushing back against that. And now Trump is obviously they're bombing Iran, and they seem to be enacting a much more interventionist agenda. And the arguments for that are not often an argument to try and win people over, but just to say you need to get into line because our enemies, the Democrats, they don't want to defeat the mullahs and the ayatollahs, so you have to just get in line. Do you agree with that? We seem to be in this sort of weird stage where no one's able to make that democratic argument.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of truth to that. I think that this is kind of Schmittian, Carl Schmitt approach to politics of everything is friend and enemy. The only political distinction that matters is that between friend and enemy. That does characterize a lot of the kind of the populist movements. And sometimes I'm slightly sympathetic to that in the sense that you arrive into government and you've won this stonking democratic majority or sometimes unexpected democratic majority, and people expect you to fix the country, number one. And number two, the problems you face are really quite profound and they're only going to get worse. And if you think of a crisis like illegal migration, which, as I said earlier, literally calls into question the sovereignty of the state, calls into question the ability of a state to enforce its own laws. These are very easy to be seen as existential political challenges. And of course, as soon as the stakes are existential, then you're justified in taking some shortcuts with regards to civil liberties or democratic standards and all the rest of it. And so I understand and I'm slightly sympathetic to why that takes place. And also you might think that you have a window of opportunity, that if you don't fix these problems now, they'll either become unfixable or the problems themselves will make it impossible for you ever to win a majority again. If you think of, for example, the way that people understand lots of illegal migration being driven in part by the hope that these people become regularized citizens, and then they'll better vote, and then they'll give a kind of thank you vote to the parties that regularize them. You understand why people on the right think, hey, we've got 4 years or whatever it is to fix this. And maybe even in today's political world, we don't have 4 years. Trump has 2 years, right? Because they have the midterm elections, which after Iran, but even then, even before Iran, never clear that Trump was going to win the midterms. So you've got 2 years in Trump's case. In the UK, you've got 4 years, but in reality, I mean, Keir Starmer was elected with supposedly a massive majority, and then he ran out of authority after a couple of weeks, but which might not be the case of a populist victory. But politics change really quickly. You've got no time to fix these problems. The problems are seen as existential. And so you can understand the temptation. I think it's temptation you shouldn't give into. I think it's wrong to give into that temptation. And you have to continue explaining to people what it is you're going to do. And I tend to think that lots of these problems, even if they require difficult fixes, you should probably still tell people about them. Like in the case of the UK, if you were to come into power and you wanted to fix the border questions, and you can't fix the border questions because of the way that human rights are structured and it involves suspending what people consider to be civil liberties, you should say to people, I was elected to fix this problem. We believe that and ideally you should obviously say this before you get into power, but we've identified that there are certain so-called procedural safeguards. I mean, we can't fix this problem. We're going to get rid of them, but we're going to be open about it. We're not going to like hide it in the minutiae of court descriptions, and then allow the public to see. And to the credit of to the credit of reform, they've identified obviously that the ECHR is a fundamental restriction on the ability to police the border and affect deportations if people have no right to be here. So they say we're going to get rid of it.
We say that as well, Jacob, the SDP.
Yes, and
just to be clear.
Too. And so I think the approach is to be open and honest with people rather than try and hide it. If you do think that this instance justifies you taking whatever shortcut you say you want to take, you should say it openly. It's not to rule it out.
I think what you're saying in kind of almost academic terms, if you go back to Hobbes, the thing, we might not agree with everything in Hobbes, but I do think a central principle which is right is the idea that there has to be some kind of covenant between the citizens and the sovereign. And Hobbes is never very clear about how that covenant is struck, but it feels to me that that covenant is broken now, and that's what we need to find a way to restrike that and and social contract, you might call it as well, those kind of ideas that we have to reforge a way that we can as a nation agree on a common purpose, which everybody won't agree on. There has to be a kind of contestation of ideas, as you were saying. There has to be some polarisation, some arguments and, political discussion and debate. But we have to have that debate to give that covenant, that legitimacy to a state. Because at the moment, states can't enact anything because, there is no popular, will behind them. There's no legitimacy behind them. And I think that is, we've talked a lot, haven't we, about this phrase, the national interest. And I think people kind of grasp that there is something that needs to happen, and loads of people are using that term, the national interest, and often it just means what they think is right. I think we've got to be really clear that the national interest is something that we all need to be part of a debate about. That is part of how we restrike that covenant.
Yeah, I agree. So sometimes you even see echoes of this. I always think it's slightly amusing, but you sometimes see echoes of this even in the political class when they kind of say, "Oh, we need we need some kind of new constitutional settlement, or we need to finally say what it is," or even people that are critics of the ECHR kind of say, "We'll have a British Bill of Rights instead. We'll spell it out finally." I have some sympathy for those kind of arguments as it happens, because they can be a kind of fulcrum around which you have that conversation about what is the basic social settlement. But I also don't think you need to be you don't always need to be constitutional in the literal sense of about this. The covenant arises when also by convention, in the sense that people feel that their concerns are listened to, you have a covenant in place between the ruled and the ruled, and people. And ideally, there's a smaller distinction between the ruled and the ruled. People think that they exercise effective power over their lives, so they don't feel like they're being ruled. They feel like they're taking part in government. So that arises naturally, and it's clear that is really lacking. One of my friends put to me the other day a point that I think is quite fundamental. That at the moment there's no sense of a moral majority. There's no sense of that you used to be able to call that kind of in American politics, you used to be able to call on all the time. The moment there's no sense that there's been a social process through which you can say, here are the basic things we agree on. And that's what's peculiarly difficult about our moment, because you guys and me and other people might agree on some things, and then you find that other people have got wildly different political assumptions. And that makes doing politics in the present era very, very difficult. But moral consensus, I think, especially in the contemporary era, in the modern age, has to be the result of a political process where people have had a chance to argue with each other. You can't just assume it. And so if we face a lack, we face a sense of shared common purpose, we need to go through a political process of arguing about what it is that we stand for. And sometimes that'll be messy. Everyone knows that some people got divorced over Brexit. Some people lost friends or whatever. And in the short term, that's true. But in the longer term, I now think there are all these people who, either politically or personally, I fell out with around Brexit, or people, even just people who you saw, like media personalities who would never give positions I'm interested in a kind of look in. And now, period of time after Brexit, a lot of things have happened. They're now somewhat more sympathetic. Some issues have changed their mind. They might, for example, have been, I don't know, they might have been on marches with people, anti-Brexit marches, and now those same people are going on the kind of pro-Palestine, pro-Hamas marches, and they suddenly say, oh, what? Hang on. That's not my politics. I was anti-Brexit, but thing. And then they start thinking about national sovereignty and blah, 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 and you kind of get that. So these things do happen over time, but they're, as I say, the result of a political process, I think.
Well, I think a real positive, and it's sort of a bittersweet thing, but real positive with what's the developments over the last couple of years is that a lot of people that blob has been chipped away at, and there are, I think this happened with gender critical women. I think it happened with liberal Jews, for example, after October the 7th. They sort of went, okay, I'm on the same side as people that are celebrating what's just happened, right? And it's been chipped away at to the point where it's not really, almost doesn't exist anymore, because there's, and a friend of ours calls it strange bedfellows. We're starting to see weird coalitions of quite liberal gender critical feminists aligning themselves with people who might be considered on the sort of the alt-right, and it's bizarre, but it's for a purpose. And I think we are just living through that. A lot of the time there's this tendency to be hypercritical and complain about the age we're living in. And I think, well, what did you expect? We've seen some of the biggest technological advances ever. We've gone from a 40-year period where people now can suddenly communicate with anybody anywhere in the world on any subject. You're able to find people that you agree with. There's naturally going to be some weird byproducts of that. I was just thinking with what you were just saying then about what we have to do, and I was thinking about the fact that we have 5 political parties in the UK that are polling at a decent level, above 10%. And if you'd said that to me 5 years ago, I'd think, oh wow, that's amazing, you've got 5 political parties to choose from. And yet a lot of people, over 50% of people didn't turn out in the Gorton and Denton by-election. A lot of people look at those 5 political parties and think, oh, no, because they're not 5 distinct political parties with visions for what they want to see. You've got, Greens, Labour and Lib Dem are sort of very similar and very sort of, I would say, like liberal establishment. You've got Conservatives, which people are fed up with after 14 years of what they consider failure. And then you've got Reform, and Reform feel like the only sort of, out of those 5, the only ones that are sort of different and interesting, and I think that's why they're generating quite a bit of support. Now, obviously, I, as a biased SDP member, would say, well, SDP is the option. But I'm thinking, the SDP in many ways is it's almost like the future centre ground of British politics. But we are operating on a level where we expect a healthy democratic discussion with the other political parties, which a lot of people, they haven't signed up to that. And I'm trying to figure out, like, how do we actually break through, not as a party, how do we get more support, but how do we break through in our attempts to generate a new political arena where we can have contesting visions for the country and we can hash it out? Because it doesn't feel like at the moment we're even able to do that.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I definitely don't have the answer to that question, but all I can do is restate it in a slightly different way, I think, which is to say that it's clear that this is a transitional political moment, and that lots of these parties, like the Greens or Reform Party, lots of people are not going to be that loyal to them, right? They may well be down the line in 10, 20, 30 years or something that we find a new settlement. But at the moment, it's a transitional and slightly transactional era, and we're still on the way to working that out. And I always think this is true of people who vote for populist parties, both of the left and of the right. Somebody was put it to a meeting that I was in the other day, put it to me, they were feeling slightly put upon because they work for Alternative for Deutschland, the AfD, Germany's right-wing populist party. They work for an MEP of that political family. And they were saying, oh, everybody assumes that the AfD are like the complete persona non grata in Brussels, even more so than us at MCC Brussels. And they were like, this is a party that is supported by really like arguably the majority of people in Eastern Germany, some large, almost plurality of people in Western Germany, and they're just like everybody who votes for them is just dismissed, completely dismissed as right-wing loons. And they were saying the point is, even if the party itself is a right-wing loony party, which it isn't, although they have some problems, but even if that's the case, that can't be true of all the voters as well.
Yeah.
And people are just searching for somewhere to express their dissatisfaction with the current order. And there might be AfD voters now. In 10 years, there might be some other kind of voter or some other kind of party. So I think the point is that this is a transitional political moment. Lots of parties are going to rise and fall. We're in a period of people working things out. I tend to think that the best feature of this moment is the decay and the destruction of the established parties, especially in our case, obviously, Labour and the Conservatives. And so even though I hate the Green Party, I kind of somewhat silently celebrate their rise, because I think they do to the Labour Party what reform hopefully will do to the Conservative Party, which is cast it into the dustbin of history. And even if I disagree with the Green Party, there's now a basis of a discussion between Green Party politics, which was always the unspoken political part of Labour, even though it was never properly represented in the Labour Party, and something else. We can now have that debate out, and we'll see where that debate gets us.
I've got a slight answer, which is around local politics.
I thought you might say
and standing in the council elections in May. So I think in thinking about how we talk to people on the doorstep about those council elections, I think all these ideas seem like really big top-down ideas, but actually I think they're bottom-up ideas. I think talking to people about why, they should have an input into their council, not just at election time, but there should be more, democratic input from them throughout the year, I think is the kind of localist version of these discussions. And that's why I think it should be a really important part of our local manifesto.
Battle of Ideas North, I think it was Stephen Knight who said, the winners will be those who control the streets. And I think he was referring to a sort of civil war scenario, but I actually really liked that, because I thought maybe that's it. It's the local politics thing. It's those that are caring to, pick up the litter and chop the hedgerows back and keep their local community in good stead. They will be the ones that succeed at the end of the day.
Yeah, hope so.
Okie doke. Shall we move on to Culture Club?
Yeah, I think that was a great debate. Thank you.
Yeah, really,
Jacob.
really
very good.
Fabulous. So, Culture Club, we haven't done Culture Club for a little while because we haven't had a guest episode for a little while, because we got sidetracked by Gorton and Denton, didn't we?
Yeah, so you'd think that I have months of cultural experiences to draw upon.
Come on.
I have nothing, absolutely nothing. I must have done something in that time, but campaigned.
Yeah. So
I sometimes feel that's the same as me. That's what it feels like having kids. Is suddenly you realise you've gone like a month, a young kid. You suddenly gone a month without reading a book that wasn't directly related to your work or something.
Yeah. I don't even have that excuse.
You were campaigning. You got a good excuse.
Yeah. So we thought we might talk about a book we've both read recently, which is Vassal State by Angus Hampton, which we read for a kind of sovereignty reading group that we're in, didn't we? But I think we both found it really, really useful in terms of understanding how the UK has just been hollowed out on so many fronts. So
it was written, 2 years ago? Mm-hmm. Subtitle, How America Runs Britain. And it's focusing on like the business side of that relationship, less so than I thought it might focus on more on defence and foreign policy, but it's much more about business and how a lot of British businesses are actually owned by American private equity. Yeah.
And I think we were all blown away by some of the stats in it and some of the kind of learnings we got from it. So things like, for example, the fact that all the payment systems we use in the UK are American owned. And every time you tap, a penny ends up in America. And that it effectively means that we, as a nation state, no longer really have control over currency. So if all those systems were suddenly currently withdrawn from us, we would not be able to function. And government has allowed that to happen in a way that has undermined our sovereignty. So, at no point has government said, oh, that's a bit odd. We shouldn't allow that to happen. We should make sure we have our own payment system. In fact, I think they have very recently set up a working group in government to look precisely at that. I think the Indian government has recently set up their own alternative system, and I think this is finally dawning on our ruling elites that that's a real problem. So, to me, that was a thing that I found was, as soon as you read it, it's really obvious, and you kind of think, well, why did I not understand that before? Why did I not really work that out? But it was a real shocker to me, really kind of shook me.
Mm. I was struck by this. There was a reference to something I wasn't aware of, which was that Philip Hammond, as Chancellor of the Exchequer, attempted to introduce a digital services tax in 2018. And we have a similar policy in the SDP of a turnover tax on multinationals. And this was effectively like a 1% turnover tax on the 30 biggest tech firms. And it had a quote from a Democratic Senator, Ron Wyden, who said, if they think they're going to introduce this, there will be no trade deal between America and the UK. And I think a lot of our establishment would look at that and go, okay, we can't introduce that then. And I think the SDP would see it slightly differently, that if you're constantly kowtowing to America in attempt at sort of maintaining this special relationship, which is not all that special, then you will constantly be selling out to them and effectively losing control of some really key strategic industries. And if things were to go bad at some point, not having independence of energy and defence and all of these industries. So it was a really scary book, and I found it very unsettling. And since reading it, I've been thinking about the fact that whenever I buy something, I'm thinking, okay, but who's this owned by? And I've been something I've been thinking about the last couple of weeks is it might be something to think about for a country, but much more transparency as to who actually owns businesses, so that consumers have a little bit more agency as to where they shop. Because I think we underestimate the fact that a lot of consumers would choose somewhere else based off who it was owned by and the practices of that business.
Yeah, I have abandoned Amazon for Argos.
Ooh.
That will bring them down in no time at all.
Hilary Salt's business is gone.
Yeah, well, it sounds like the book. I'll pick it up and give it a read. I think that these topics are always, I think, intellectually challenging for me, because I have this slight, I guess you say, nationalist spirit to myself of thinking that it's outrageous what's happened to British industry especially since the Second World War. That has its own reasons. Some of them you've identified. There'll be others. And I think that a serious country should look to exercise sovereignty on important things that, like constituent elements, energy, telecoms, those kind of things are the critical industries that you need to be able to exercise some degree of control over. But at the same time, and this is especially a discussion that's really gathering steam in the European context, in the EU context, there's this attempt to position an alternative to American companies that I think is at the same time really, really problematic, because what it comes from is not genuine concern over sovereignty, but one, a sense of economic inferiority, and two, a desire for control, to exercise control. So you see this quite clearly in the digital space, in social media, where they even talk about launching their own alternative to X because the big bad Elon Musk allows too much disinformation and all the rest of it. And so we need a European alternative that we can exercise sovereign European control over, et cetera, et cetera. But it's also, I think, sometimes the way this discussion is framed out, and I'm not saying this is what you two have done, but the way it's framed out, and that's why I'm hesitant to give it too much support, even in a general sense, is that it mistakes a kind of consequence for a cause. So, and this is really true in a lot of European and British contexts, where we have bad regulation policies with regards to the digital sphere. We have bad energy policies that we have. So we have a load of bad structural things going on, and as a result, we don't have tech companies. And then the response to that is to say, oh, well, we're just going to mandate that we have an English or British or European, whatever alternative to these things, which is only ever going to be like the kind of Victory cigarettes version of the real thing, right? The Victory cigarettes from 1984, the ones that were always falling apart. And so I think that seems to me like the logic. It seems, at least in the EU sense, you think of we have a buy EU approach or a buy British approach. It just means we'll be using worse stuff. And I dare say, Hilary, your relationship to Argos is probably Amazon is probably a little example of that. And so I'm not averse to us saying, right, we're going to support British industry where it makes sense. We need to have a sense of control over key things like steel and energy and all the rest of it. But at the same time, I want people to be laser focused on that, on those fundamentals. Like, why do we not have a British or even a European leading AI firm, really? Britain should be in a pretty good place. There's talk that some might move over to the UK at the top end of artificial intelligence. Britain has lots of the ingredients necessary, but it's still the case that there's a risk-averse attitude with regards to regulation in Britain that means that an AI company would much rather set up shop in Texas or California than in London. So those are issues I just don't want to get distracted from when we talk about some of the useful things that you guys raised.
Yeah, I think you're quite right. And to be fair to Angus Hanson, he does touch upon some of the reasons why British companies are more vulnerable to being taken over by American companies, and talks a little bit about regulation. Just on AI, and you're right to be thinking about the underlying causes of why we are not doing so well in these sectors, and we are in a good place to benefit from the AI innovation. But something you'll say frequently is, what does AI need? It needs a lot of energy, and we have amongst the highest energy prices anywhere in the world. So I think what you're right about is that a lot of our sort of establishment politicians, they all look at the sort of the surface level problem and just impose a solution from above that doesn't work at all. We need to think about the root causes of why these things are happening and address those.
Correct. So anyway, I think it's a recommend from us to read Vassal State.
Yeah, I thought just on, I thought you were going to mention the care home thing from Sale.
Oh yes, yeah. So because we'd read that, excuse me, back to my cancel campaign again. I was thinking about, what does that mean? What does that look like? These same issues. What do they look like at a council level? And so one of the things I did was just had a look at the, I'm in Trafford, I looked at the Trafford Council website and found the list of care homes that they recommend, and just found the one that was closest to me, and then had a look at it. And it turns out it's actually owned by a company that looks British on the outside, but is actually owned by a company listed on the New York Stock Exchange. So obviously in Sale where I live, the big contentious thing is that our council tax is going up by 7.5%. And what the local councillors always say is, well, we've got all this big statutory stuff that we have to provide over here, and we can only really fiddle about with that little bit there. But that big statutory stuff, the biggest element of it is adult social care. And they are providing adult social care by making payments to a company ultimately owned in the US. So the kind of most intimate and personal care for our vulnerable elderly people is being funded by the local council in a way that doesn't use, even a British company. And that feels wrong to me. And I just don't think that when people think about those statutory services that a council has to provide, surely part of that democratic debate that we were talking about should be local people saying, we don't actually think that should be provided by a company listed on the New York Stock Exchange.
And that goes back to this idea of bringing politics closer and making it more accountable.
Yes, absolutely.
Right, should we get onto your Culture Club item, Jacob?
Yeah, sure. And I wanted to throw in something. I might be a bit late to the party, but Michel Houellebecq's latest, I think some people say last novel, Annihilation, was translated into English towards, I think, the tail end of last year. I read that. I'd really strongly recommend it. It's if anyone's read any other Michel Houellebecq novels, I guess you kind of know what you're getting yourself in for. But it's at times depressing, at times very, very funny, at very piercing political insight. Lots of soul searching of slightly atomized contemporary figures. Um, but the reason why I specifically like this book, and we recommend it even to people who never, it's not just like a Michel Houellebecq purist novel. It's I think, his most humane novel that he's written. Um, and it features, I mean, a large part of the book is about the question of assisted dying, assisted suicide, right? A large part of the book, it features that. It features discussion about care homes quite a lot. But all of this is going on at the same time as the protagonist is embroiled in this suspicious international terrorist plot that involves blowing up of oil tankers and all. There's like all these things swirling. The French state is trying to exercise power, but is kind of failing at every turn. But there are still nonetheless some useful people that can be relied on at the heart of the state to try and get things done. And the character is navigating these kind of interpersonal relationships, romantic relationships that feel very of the moment, in that they're like sometimes feel transient, yet at other times feel really existential. Um, he's also Michel Houellebecq is a fantastic just observer of contemporary life. I think it's fantastic. Not nearly as depressing as the title makes it sound, Annihilation, and is hilariously funny in places. And I think it really, he's written a number of books that some people like, some people dislike. He's acquired a reputation as being a kind of a right-wing author because of some of the topics he's touched on, like submission, which looked at the possible, I guess, the what we referred to earlier, the Islamo left alliance. Uh, but this book demonstrates, I think, quite clearly that he's not just a political writer in the sense that you read him if you're right wing as well or conservative and you like to see someone who's moaning at the modern world. No, he's a great writer because he's observant, got a real sense of humanity that comes across in all of the characters, and the sense that, without giving too much away about what actually happens in the book, the sense that comes across is that it's the people at the political margin that are and that doing things that they're not got into necessarily for political reasons, that are the decisive figures in contemporary life, and people just exercising some measure of control or sovereignty over some small corner of their own individual existence, that kind of, in the last analysis, kind of save or justify society.
That reinventing agency
That
point
sounds
again.
like you.
It does.
Was the character based on Hilary, the one that's
We're going to discuss it. This is my
reasserting
chance for a
sovereignty?
little plug, because we're going to discuss it at an event I put together every year called The Academy, which is an intellectual retreat, a weekend. The Academy is organised by the Ideas Matter charity. I guess if you're kind to me, you'll stick the link in the show notes so people can
We will.
get it. The theme of the overall event is Hollow Leviathan, the state against the demos. So we're going to look at the sense that some of the things we talked about here, the hollowing out of the state. But we chose the title Hollow Leviathan because we want to get the fact that even though the state enjoys no legitimacy, it's very, very authoritarian. And maybe those things, two things are connected. Come to the event and find out. But so that's the theme of the event this year. It's going to take place in the summer, and it's a great weekend getaway. Come and have dinner and a drink and lots of interesting talks with some like-minded people. We really recommend it to people who, even if you've never been to such an event before, take the weekend, bring your friend or your partner or whatever, stay the night, and talk about politics and philosophy and literature in some comfortable settings with some free-thinking people. Recommend it to everyone.
Fantastic.
Superb.
Is that in Hertfordshire or somewhere, isn't it?
It's in Bedfordshire. It's in a
Bedfordshire,
place
that's
called
it.
Y Boston Lakes, which is on the Bedfordshire-Cambridgeshire border.
Fabulous. We will definitely put a link to that in
We
the show
will.
notes.
Did you want to mention Living Freedom as well?
Yeah, sure.
Jacob,
Another
yeah.
initiative from Ideas Matter charity. Is a charity that I spend a fair bit of my time with. A fantastic organisation. Another event that they organised was alluded to. I gave a lecture at it on this vibe shift concept last year. Living Freedom is an initiative for young people. I think it's officially up to the age of 30, but If you're youngish and interested in meeting free-thinking people and delving into slightly more political topics than those I mentioned with regards to the academy, but Living Freedom is a place where all the big political issues in a relaxed environment full of fellow free thinkers. It's grown over the years. It's become a tremendous place. Lots of people that you see cropping, or I see cropping up on television or in politics now in the UK. I'm like, oh, 3 or 4 years ago, I remember you at Living Freedom. I remember you made a really good point. So if you're the kind of person who thinks themselves as wanting to be at the cutting edge of political activity and you're youngish, as I say, under 30, go onto the Ideas Matter website and you can find out more.
I was trying to figure out if it includes 30-year-olds because I'm going to be 30 this summer, and I was thinking, do I sneak in?
Sure, it does. Yeah, and
Okay,
even if not, we can
good.
make exceptions.
I think last year we Take Me Home sponsored a place on the on Living Freedom for a Take Me Home listener who applied. So we will see if we can do that again, and if we can, we'll tell you about it in an episode next week.
Fantastic.
Good.
Okay, doke.
So thanks everybody for listening. As always, we would urge you to recommend this to your friends, to give us a lovely review, and to follow the show so you don't miss our episodes. We should be back on a more even keel now we have Gorton and Denton behind us. So we will see you next week. Thanks so much, Jacob. Thank you.
No, thank you. I'll be recommending it to all my friends too.
Brilliant.